Hey everyone, welcome. This is Baron, and if you are looking for your League starter for the upcoming Path of Exile 1 expansion Secrets of the Atlas, I have a humble suggestion to add to your list of options, my Arc Ignite Elementalist. People look for different things in a League starter, so I'm just going to give you the honest rundown of the build and let you be the judge of whether it's the right fit for you. For a quick word of background, during the previous league, Settlers of Kelgar, I put out an extensively detailed multi-video guide for this build with a particular focus on making the guide new player friendly. And while that guide can, by and large, still be used, it's safe to follow along with the existing videos and all that, there were some modest changes in the patch notes for the upcoming league, and that means that I'll have to publish a sort of addendum or updated version of the guide. The Elementalist has been changed in several ways by the patch notes, which the summary is that it causes us to lose a little bit of damage but gain a lot of defense. The build had great damage to begin with and can stomach the loss of a little bit of it, so we are full steam ahead. I will be league starting the build myself and publishing build diary style updates for anybody who wants to league start along with me, and you can kind of see how it's been going for me, what decisions I've been making, what upgrades I've been making, all that kind of stuff. So this video here, this will serve as a brief introduction to the build and cover the important changes that are happening this league so that you know how and why we are diverging from the original guide if you do want to follow along with those original videos too. I will then finish this video with a quick summary of the leveling and upgrade process, but if you are a newer player, feel free to grab those introductory leveling videos as well for more detail. Also, I will have my Path of Building file, POB file, for this build linked in the description if you want to follow along, and it has an extremely detailed leveling and upgrade section in the notes, which I will be only covering an abbreviated version of in this video. Also, if you haven't worked much with Path of Building before, be sure that you use the loadouts menu at the upper right of the screen to switch between the different versions of the build that show it at escalating stages, the different leveling stages, and then once you reach maps, the different investment stages as you put more and more currency into it. And by using that loadout menu, you can swap between the gems, tree, gear, settings, all with one click rather than having to go in and swap everything individually. So much easier that way. So let's talk about the build. The main skill, as the title says, is Arc. Arc is a lightning skill that, as the name implies, arcs or chains a bolt of lightning between several enemies. The central gimmick of the skill is that it deals more damage to enemies the more remaining chains it has left during that cast. So the very first enemy you hit with a cast, if the skill is tracking that it's going to have 9 chains to other enemies after that, you get a big 135% more multiplier to the damage. And then the next enemy, you get 15% less than that and 15% less than that, and it gets less and less as you go. But what this means is that it is a really effective skill for both clearing trash mobs and for single target, because for the record, there don't actually need to be any other enemies nearby. It gets bonus damage for that first enemy based on how many chains could have happened. Also, the other important thing to note about the skill is that while many skills that are able to do a big initial hit like this end up having their damage penalized when applying damaging ailments like bleed, poison, or ignite, that is not the case for Arc. We are getting the same damage bonus for ailments that we are getting for hits. And that does bring us to another central gimmick of the build. Despite being a lightning skill, we are actually inflicting a fire-based ailment called an ignite with the skill. The build is taking advantage of an Elementalist ascendancy node called Shaper of Flames, which allows all types of damage to contribute to the ignite, not just fire damage. As a reminder, or a quick primer if you're a newer player, Ignite is a type of ailment that deals fire damage over time to enemies for a brief period, and the strength or rate of that damage over time is based on the strength of the initial hit that causes it. Ignite, in our case, it will deal all fire damage. Once that it turns from a hit into an ailment, that ailment is all fire damage, even in this build where multiple different types of damage are triggering the ignite, they all kind of get combined, and once the ignite begins, it's all fire from there. Mechanically, ignite is also a game element that it happens to be a great source of what's called proliferation, the ability to hit one enemy and then have many enemies die as a result. Ignite Proliferation is a stat or property that can come from several different kinds of sources, but ultimately we want to get it on our gloves. They have the lowest opportunity cost. It is important to note that although the initial hit damage in this build is not necessarily negligible, it is a part of our overall damage per second, DPS, but the hit damage is also not the focus. Most of our damage scaling options that we're taking will be focused on increasing our damage over time, the Ignite. So here are some other important defining features of the build. So first, the endgame variant of the build, once we have established some currency and can purchase some upgrades, aims to use some elemental damage conversion shenanigans, and the full guide will get more into this. We pair with the Nebula Scepter, the incandescent heart body armor, melding of the flesh. We get 90% to all elemental resistances. There's this cool little circle of stuff that we kind of all weave together to make a very powerful build, and there's more detail, like I said, in the full guide on that. And I will say that prior to us making that switch, the build functions just fine. We're going to deal millions of damage in our early mapping setup before the changeover, just using basic rare gear, maybe a couple cheap uniques. I'm just pointing out that there is a main set of upgrades that we are shooting for once we reach the end game. It's just what we're targeting in the long run. Now, there's an obvious question that comes up next, but unfortunately, if you want to know how much it costs to do that changeover, unfortunately no one can really give you an exact number in terms of how many divines that those upgrades are going to take, at least not before League start. We don't know what the economy is going to look like. We don't know if builds like this one are going to be popular, unpopular. We don't know if drop rates will have changed, but I know that this is an important thing that many people want to know, so I will do my best to give a very approximate estimate. I just really want you to take it with a grain of salt because this is not knowable information right now. We can only estimate. So I would say that the early map version of this, when you just have graduated from the campaign and you're only just starting to fill out your atlas, that can be done on entirely self-found gear, stuff that you find, maybe some basic crafting currency, put it on your crafting bench to get an extra mod. That's it. You don't even need to enter trade to get this thing to maps. There is a basic endgame variant, can do T16 maps, can do a few million DPS, and this can be set up for around, again, estimating 5 divines or so. Hopefully no more than that. And these 5 divines, I know that can be intimidating if you're newer. These can be farmed up along the way. You might be saying, how am I supposed to even make these 5 divines if I'm not in endgame maps yet? Don't worry. I can help you with that. I can get you there if you're nervous at all about that. And then the basic changeover that we talked about, not having all of the end game equipment yet, but a basic changeover to what's called Chaos Inoculation. More on that in a minute. I'm going to estimate that basic changeover is maybe 20 divine. And that's going to be anywhere between 6 and 10 million damage when we do that changeover, and we're going to get a lot tankier when we do it. And then after that upgrade, the sky's kind of the limit. I can offer you advice on incremental upgrades that you can make, whether you want to spend 1 divine, 10, or 100. You could spend hundreds of divines on this, and each one that you spend will increase your damage and survivability. So this is it's a nice money sink build. If you really want to make this your one build for the League, you can take this to T17s, to End Wave Simulacrums, Juiced Rogue Exiles, Delving. You could even use this to Uber Boss if you want, though admittedly that is not the build's specialty, nor is it my specialty as a player. I am what you might call mechanically challenged, or at least not mechanically gifted. But you could do it. You're not going to be deleting Uber Bosses, but if you know the mechanics of the fight, this certainly has the defenses to not get immediately one-shot and the damage to grind them down. But the next major fact to mention about the build is that like I said, the endgame variant will aim to take this Chaos Inoculation keystone. It sets our life equal to 1, which sounds bad, but it makes us immune to chaos damage, so we can rely completely on Energy Shield as our main health pool. Under normal circumstances, chaos damage would bypass Energy Shield, So this is making it so that we can safely use Energy Shield as our main pool and not have our one hit point of actual life get deleted by anything. It has to, the Energy Shield protects all of it. So the thing is, this is kind of why we need to save up for that one big swap in the end game. Switching over to Chaos Inoculation is not something that you can do piecemeal. It's kind of all or nothing. You have to have the gear on hand to ensure that you have at least, like, I'm going to recommend, there's some personal preference here, but I'm going to recommend no less than like 3.2K Energy Shield minimum after the changeover, and really the more the better. Part of that, of getting that high Energy Shield, is ensuring that you have enough mana reservation efficiency to squeeze in the Discipline aura for the Energy Shield that it provides. So that is a part of the cost that you're going to incur trying to switch over to this. But there is the payoff. It means that the next major feature of the build is that it is damned tanky and getting tankier with these patch notes. So, starting off by being completely immune to chaos damage, one of the most dangerous damage types in the game, that is certainly a good start. Doing this also has the potent side effect of allowing us to get a big defensive boost from our chosen body armor. Incandescent Heart certainly has its offensive benefits. That's a big part of why we take it. It lets us play around with these triple elemental conversion shenanigans I mentioned by allowing us to add extra chaos damage at each stage of the conversion. It starts as lightning. We get extra lightning damage as chaos. We convert it to cold. We get extra cold damage as chaos. We convert it to fire. We get extra fire damage as chaos. So Incandescent Heart definitely has the offensive benefits, but it also has the defensive benefits that we're going to take advantage of the line that says 25% of elemental damage is taken as chaos. Well, we're immune to chaos damage, so this means that we are deleting 25% of elemental damage that's incoming. This is amazing. This also gets around the normal restriction on you're not able to reduce incoming damage by more than 90% at the mitigation phase. Well, this is happening before the mitigation phase, so we actually kind of get around that limitation. We can be taking even less than 10% of the incoming hit damage. And then just, there's a ton of other layers and layers of defense to this build. We've got 90% to all elemental resistances. Like I said, we're immune to all elemental ailments in the endgame version of the build. Immune to bleed, immune to corrupted blood. And then on top of that, we've got endurance charges, max block, max spell block, and then the Aegis Aurora Shield to cap it all off and capitalize on all that max block by recovering a healthy chunk of Energy Shield anytime that we block. So, like I said, overall, if you want to take the time and currency and turn this into your endgame currency sync build, you can get, after the patch, we're estimating DPS on this one, but I would say that I can safely promise 25 million DPS after the patch, and I suspect that if we make the right tweaks to the endgame variant of this, we can get it back up to the dot cap, so-called dot cap in the game. Cannot process more than 36 million damage over time per second, and we are damage over time, so I think that we can get back there with the right tweaks, but we're going to have to see how it goes in practice, how good mercenaries are, all that stuff. And this respectable damage, look, it's not 100 million damage, we're not deleting uber bosses or anything, but this very respectable 20 to 30 million damage that I can tell you we will deal, that is coming along with a very potent, resilient defensive package, made even better by some of the changes that I'm going to mention coming up in the patch notes. And then, just to note, on the topic of tankiness, this build is one that can make very effective use of Mage Blood, if you are the type of player who likes to grind for one of those. I know that not everybody does. I will say, one of the honest drawbacks of the build, just for your awareness, is that the movement speed is just okay prior to Mage Blood. Mage Blood always makes you go fast. I can zoom around like this because I'm wearing a Mage Blood. And, without the Mage Blood, it's just all right. It's not bad, but we do rely on shield charge to navigate between packs. It's just faster. Now, for anyone out there who's listening who mostly plays Path of Exile 2, you can disregard this section because regardless of whether you're wearing Mage Blood or not, this build and any build in POE1 is probably going to feel like a speed demon compared to what you're used to. But in any case, I mentioned that the patch notes would impact our defenses, So let's use that as a transition and talk about those patch notes. And an important part of this conversation is talking about what is not changing with the patch notes. There is no single piece of gear or skill gem in this build that has been directly affected by the notes. No need to recalculate arc gem DPS or find different core gearing solutions. We're unchanged there. No major nerfs or buffs. So what is changing for the build? Well, for starters, one thing is changing for everyone, at least for this league. Access to the mercenaries, the companions, your sidekicks. These guys act as sort of like animate guardians on steroids. They can, unlike animate guardians who can only equip items at a limited set of item slots, these guys have the full complement of item slots that a player has. Rings, amulet, weapon, shield, gloves, like the whole thing. And this is going to give us a lot of options. So in addition to just having another body on the field to kind of draw attention and body block, which is good enough by itself, we're also going to be able to arrange for these mercenaries to give us buffs and potentially the enemy some debuffs. So let's talk about, like, I'm just spitballing at this point, we're going to have to play around with it, but like, what kind of things should we consider to give to our mercenary to make our build better? So there's obviously the usual animate guardian suspects, like anything that you can put on an animate guardian, you can put on here too, and more. So there's like the Learcast helmet, Dying Breath staff, the Kingmaker axe, though, spoiler alert, that is going to be hideously, outlandishly expensive this league. The Kingmaker axe, it's already kind of expensive most leagues, and now that every single build is basically going to be running an animate guardian, it's going to be too expensive. But then, Garb of the Ephemeral, there's a lot of different stuff that you can run that was already viable for an animate guardian. But then, I'm thinking about Ash Caller Wand, Zoph's Heart Amulet, or Polaric Devastation Ring, any of which can cause enemies to be covered in ash for increasing fire damage. We could be looking at the Flame Sight Helmet, Legacy of Fury Boots to scorch enemies, or go beyond Scorch. What if you wanted to inflict all three alternative ailments? As long as it's easy enough to get the mercenaries' attributes to be equal, use Leadership's Price to inflict Scorch, Brittle, and Sap, all of which are good for us in different ways. And then here's the one that I'm really thinking about. The Calm's Binding Belt, and that would let us double dip. If it works, if we can make this work, which I think we can, Calm's Binding will allow us to double dip on a really cool interaction that we're going to talk about when we get to the Changed Ascendancy nodes, and that is right now. That's the transition. This is probably the most important thing that we have to talk about, since technically, my other videos cover most of the rest of this stuff. My videos, the notes in the POB. This section here, though, is the truly new information that we have to contend with. So what is changing? All three Shaper of nodes on the Elementalist are changing. Shaper of Winter, Shaper of Storms, Shaper of Flames. They all give you the ability to inflict the associated elemental ailment for that element. You can do it with any type of damage now. You can inflict Chill with any damage with Shaper of Winter. You can inflict Ignite with any type of damage with Shaper of Flames. So this part is unchanged. But here's the thing. All three used to have special bonus effects that were tied to a requirement that if you dealt at least the majority of your damage with the appropriate element, you would get a bonus effect on top of the ailment. So, yes, you can inflict ignites with any type of damage if you want, but you do want to try and make at least the majority of the damage fire so that you get this special bonus. It was more damage in that case. But all three of these bonuses, one for each of the Ascendancy nodes, have been replaced with general bonuses that do not rely on the damage type, and they provide different effects than we got before. The most important negative for us, and the one hit that we're taking this patch, is that Shaper of Flames no longer gets its fairly potent 25% more multiplier for dealing with fire damage. This is not actually going to affect the leveling of the build in any way. The way this build levels, we're going to be well into maps and graduating to the 5 divine-ish setup that I talked about before this is even going to affect us. Prior to that, we weren't dealing majority fire damage to begin with. At that point, when we transition to that early setup, at that point we'll be losing about 16% of the damage from where it would have been in the last league, which is sizable but not catastrophic. We are still doing millions of damage on a shoestring budget. We get a big defensive boost that I'm going to describe, and there may be additional late patch notes coming this week that mitigate the damage loss further. We'll have to see. So overall, these patch notes are currently kind of a lateral. We have great, just less than before damage, and our defenses went from great to wow. Let's talk about how and why. For starters, the replacement bonus on Shaper of Flames is that all enemies ignited by us have 40% of their physical damage that they are attempting to deal to us, the player. 40% of the physical damage is converted to fire when they hit us. This is amazing. I want to take a little bit of a sidetrack here to go into detail about how this works and why it is amazing. So, to be clear, with our 90% maximum resistances and the conversion of elemental damage to chaos, aka deleting it with Incandescent Heart, the endgame version of the build is taking an effective 7-ish% of damage from incoming fire damage. And that's if the hit wasn't blocked, which is going to be a lot of the time. But what this means, us reducing our fire damage by so much, is that this new line on Shaper of Flames can effectively be read as, if you manage to hit an enemy at least once before they hit you, delete 37% of all of their physical damage before your armor and endurance charges attempt to mitigate it, and then take another 3% of it as fire damage. That's how the math works out. And granted, it's definitely a downside that we have to ignite an enemy to get the effect. I wish it had been phrased more like, if you have ignited an enemy recently, or something like that, then you get the effect. But that's not the way of it, and it is a downside. But honestly, due to the chaining and proliferation nature of our skill, we're going to find this much easier to do than a lot of other builds and skills. We're going to be off-screening enemies all the time. So even guys firing arrows from a screen away might have already gotten hit by one of our ignites. It's just the thing that we're going to have to worry about, the thing where this is going to bite us in the rear end, is going to be during bossing. There are phases where they go immune sometimes. And if they are able to deal damage while they are immune, well, they're not ignited, so we're not converting any of that physical damage to fire. And that's a drawback, unfortunately. But in the majority of cases, when we do get this defensive layer, it is very, very potent to just be able to delete a bunch of physical damage. Remember, you need more and more armor to mitigate bigger hits. So shaving off some of the damage off the top before giving armor a crack at it makes every little bit of armor that you can get way more valuable, because we're not just getting the damage mitigation from removing that big chunk of it and moving it over to fire. We are getting the synergistic mitigation effect that armor is much better able, just in terms of percent of damage mitigated, it's better able to deal with incoming hits when the incoming damage starts at a lower value. So let's talk a practical example, because that's kind of vague. Practically speaking, let's say an enemy is making a very big, powerful physical hit. It is over 9,000 damage. So let's call it a 9,001 damage physical hit. Let's say that you have, hypothetically, 20,000 armor. That is a reasonable number you might have at some point during the end game. The official armor calculation says that you will then take around 82% of that incoming 9,000 damage hit. You'll take around 7,365 damage straight to your health pool. In other words, armor can mitigate around 18% of it if you've got 20,000 armor. Also, you definitely die. This build doesn't get anywhere close to 7,300 energy shield, so that is a one-shot, and not just by a little. But what happens if we were to peel off 40% of that damage and start with a 5,400 damage physical hit? Well, you might expect that you still mitigate 18% of the remainder, which would leave you with around 4,400 physical damage and around 250 fire damage, and also probably still dead unless you have a late game amount of energy shield and are running the more defensive helmet option like I've got on here. If you're not doing this, if you're not at the ultra late game and have a defensive helmet, that's still probably going to kill you. but that's not actually the amount of damage that you take as a result of how armor works. Remember, armor doesn't subtract some flat amount of damage from a hit. It mitigates a percentage of that hit, and the same amount of armor is more effective against smaller hits. And it makes sense if you think about it. Like, just take a step back and think about it. If this is confusing to you, think about it in these terms. You wouldn't want a player in Act 1 to require 200,000 armor, to be able to reduce any damage from a boss hit. That'd be crazy. It's impossible. But at the same time, you wouldn't want a player who's fighting the Uber Shaper endgame boss to be able to mitigate 90% of his physical damage just because the player has an amount of armor that would have been acceptable in Act 1. Neither of those outcomes are good. So armor has to deal with hits better at smaller values. At the armor at the same value, a lower hit, it deals with a higher percentage of it. So smaller hit equals higher percentage of that hit mitigated. So in this case, you would actually take around 3,900 physical and 250 fire instead, and you actually have a decent shot of surviving that hit if you've got a middling endgame amount of energy shield. If you can get up around that 4,000 mark, that's pretty good. The difference is magnified even further if we have endurance charges, which we usually will. They add a flat amount of physical damage reduction on top that, unlike armor, is not reliant on the size of the hit. It reduces the damage by the same amount whether the hit is coming in for 100 damage or 100,000. So in this case, we would take another 1,000-ish damage off if we've got our endurance charges up. So against this big 9,000 damage hit, remember that's what we're talking about, with a 20,000 armor pool, you could sort of think of that 40% that we're peeling back and turning into fire, you can think of it as more like peeling off 45% in terms of the fact that it's giving your armor a helping hand. We are requiring less of our armor. We're allowing it to manage a smaller incoming hit. And remember, so this hit that we are now surviving handily with over 1,000 health left, this is something that absolutely overkilled us by thousands of damage before this patch change, and we can survive it now. This effect gets even stronger, even more pronounced when we are not dealing with a devastating pinnacle level hit like a 9 or 10,000 damage hit. Let's say you start with a still not great but much more manageable 2,000 damage hit instead of 9,000. Well, that same 20,000 armor, you'd normally be able to mitigate around 2/3 of the hit, leaving you with just 33% left, or 680 damage taken to your health pool. Not enough to kill you, but enough that you'd prefer not to take a whole bunch of these all at the same time. So let's think about the fact that this is already a pretty big jump. Going from 9,000 damage down to 2,000, we are now mitigating 66% of the damage instead of 18%. That's a big jump. And so, hopefully you can see what I mean about armor being much better percentage-wise at mitigating small to medium-sized hits. And then peeling off that 40% damage, converting it to fire, that means that the physical damage starts at 1,200 instead. This brings the final damage all the way down to 258 physical and a little bit of fire. And so this is only 13% of the original hit. So on these smaller hits, you remember how I said for the big hit, the conversion, instead of being worth 40%, was kind of worth 45 because of how much help it was giving the armor. At these lower values, it's giving the armor even more help. It's making up even more of the gap. So it's worth more like a 60% reduction or conversion in this case. So the end of the story is that with elemental resistances and armor combined, we wind up for that particular hit having a total of 87% damage reduction, and having any endurance charges up at all will easily get you to that 90% cap on damage reduction. This hefty 2,000 damage, fairly scary hit will come in at only around 200. We're barely even going to feel it with Aegis Aurora topping up 400 energy shield every time we block a hit. And on top of all that, remember how I talked about the Calm's Binding Belt as a potential item to give our mercenary? This item creates an invisible aura that adds to this effect. It is the same effect, and they will work together additively. It causes enemies to convert yet another 25% of their physical damage to fire. if there's, if we can keep our mercenary alive, and if this works the way it appears to work, that would mean that when combined with the ascendancy, we are outright deleting fully 60% of physical damage and offloading another 5% of it to fire to lighten the load on armor. This is, a massive hit incoming for 10,000 damage would wind up being dealt with by armor that only sees a 3,500 damage hit incoming. The rest went somewhere else. So 3,500 damage hit, even with a middling amount of armor in some endurance charges, I'd be surprised if you even took 2,000 damage from that. And that would have been a catastrophic one-shot. Remember, without this conversion mechanic, a 10,000 damage incoming hit versus 20,000 armor, you're gonna die bad. But by converting this damage, we turn it into 2,000 or less damage taken to health pool. Yeah, that's a chunky hit, but it's not a massive overkill either. And keep in mind, that's only with 20,000 armor. This build can scale armor higher than that, especially if you are the type of player who likes to save up for a mage blood. Look at this. My character currently has, just sitting in hideout here, 63,000 armor. So yeah, this effect is getting more and more potent against bigger and bigger hits. It's great. So although it is sad to lose the damage from Shaper of Flames, I acknowledge it. Hopefully you can now see what a potent defensive bonus we're getting against the type of damage that we were previously weakest to. Big physical hits. Unfortunately, this is where we have to talk about a little bit of unexpected bad news. I originally recorded this video on Sunday afternoon Eastern US time, and I, in that original recording, talked up how amazing Shaper of Winter was going to be for us, and how I was going to switch away from Heart of Destruction as my last Ascendancy node to take this instead. However, Grinding Gear Games must have had cameras in my office and heard me recording, because overnight that night they released an addendum to the patch notes that kind of gutted, at least for our build, the new version of Shaper of Winter. In this particular build, it means Shaper of Winter is, in my estimation, no longer worth taking in a softcore environment. Basically, the long and the short of it is it had a damage dealing component, and a really potent one that basically gave you a second shock effect, and they just took that away. So it's still very good on builds that deal their main damage as cold due to the existence of bone chill support that kind of replicates that effect. But for us, who were trying to scale fire damage, this becomes a purely defensive node. It is still, don't get me wrong, an outstanding defensive layer, and in hardcore you would not be blamed for taking this, but at present it provides this particular build no offense the way it was slated to in the original patch notes. Now, Grinding Gear Games tells us that there may be, coming up over this week before launch, there may be further passive tree changes coming before the launch that address cold skills and caster skills. So we can huff a little hopium, wish that perhaps this is why they had to remove the damage from Shaper of Winter. Maybe they thought it was too strong with whatever changes they're going to make to the tree. And you know what? If that's the case, cool. We'll revisit, we'll redo the math, we'll consider going that route, we'll just compare it in POB. But in the meantime, in the absence of that information, I am staying the course with Heart of Destruction for more damage against bosses, and then increased Ignite proliferation area of effect in non-bossing scenarios. So then the last change to the Ascendancy that's going to be pertinent to this guide is simply that Shaper of Storms got a slight but noticeable buff, particularly in bossing situations, the difficult ones where you really need it the most. It now causes bosses that maybe you would have previously struggled to inflict a big shock on because their hit pool is so big, their ailment threshold is so big. Now that boss will automatically take a nice chunky 25% shock. So that is a simple change, but it's definitely appreciated, and it is measurable as an improvement for the build. And then before we move on from the Ascendancy changes, I'll just quickly address something that I've been asked several times, and that is whether it would be viable to take the powerful newly combined Golem node, Liege of the Primordial. And my answer, after doing a lot of math and research on this, is yes, with a caveat. So let's be clear, the official version of this guide is not presently going that route. I'm going to be starting with a version that does not take Liege of the Primordial unless something big changes. If you want to go that route, actually, feel free to stop by my Discord where we are discussing all these different variations of the build. Several members of my Discord have expressed an interest in going that route, so we can kind of compare notes and that kind of thing. I would just say if you are somebody who is thinking of going with the golems, keep in mind that you are occasionally going to have sudden downtime of both offensive and defensive buffs if you wander into a sticky situation and your golems suddenly die. By my math, the golem variant of this build with a few tweaks could have the best defenses of all the variants and the second best offenses of everything that I experimented with. But the golem downtime, while they wait that 4 seconds to respawn, that's what concerns me. That's what makes me hesitant, and that's what makes me not want to take it, at least at first, at least until we see how it goes. If we see that in practice, people who are playing that variant of the build are able to get their golems to survive in difficult content, I may revise, I may go in that direction eventually, and if so, I'll of course release a detailed update to the build. But for now, we are playing it safe, we are leaving our Ascendancy nodes unchanged from the original guide, and we are taking the Heart of Destruction node. All 4 of the Ascendancy nodes that we take are the 4 that we would have taken last league. So, with Ascendancy and changes from patch notes out of the way, let's wrap up with an overview of how you would want to level this build and do your initial endgame upgrades. There is a much more detailed version of this in the POB notes section, so feel free to cut the video here and just take a look at that if you're more of a visual reader type person. But for starters, as with almost every other build in the game, our options for skills early in Act 1 are pretty limited, and they do not include the skill that we are eventually going to use as our main one. So for the first 12 to 14 levels throughout Act 1, you can just use any setup that you find comfortable. My personal recommendation is Freezing Pulse with a Holy Flame Totem, both for crowd control and boss DPS. It's a lifesaver against Brutus, for example. But honestly, Act 1 is such a bare-bones experience that you can realistically choose any gem setup that you're comfortable with. Some people like to level Act 1 with Rolling Magma. Others people like Stormblast Mine. There's a lot of this that just comes down to personal preference. I've done them all. They're all reasonable. None of them are great because it's Act 1. You're supposed to feel kind of weak. But by the end of Act 1, if you would like, and this is what I will be doing, this is how I'm going to be leveling it, you can switch over to Arc and then level the rest of the build throughout the campaign with its main skill. I know it appeals to me, I know it appeals to a lot of people who don't like the sensation of feeling like they're playing a totally different build and then suddenly have to adopt an entirely new playstyle when they get to the end game and swap over to their main skill. It can feel awkward. So there are definitely other leveling methods out there for the Witch, for the Elementalist. You're free to follow those if you prefer and just respec later. But for the purposes of this guide, I will be going with Arc from the end of Act 1 on out. As a result of this, though, I will point out briefly, we will be very briefly during Act 1 be taking a node on the tree that looks like a dead node unless you happen to be leveling with Stormblast Mines in Act 1. We will be passing through Lightning Walker node here. It's a node that gives lightning damage, and just the way it works out in terms of timing is that the number of skill points we will have assigned when we get there, we're not going to have Arc unlocked yet when it comes time to take this node. Like, I could have you take something else and then immediately respec this 2 or 3 levels later, but like that feels silly to me. We're not going to suffer DPS wise for having, a wrong notable for like 10 or 20 minutes at most of leveling. So like, I just say take Lightning Walker, consider it an investment into future you, into 15-minute in the future you. Freezing Pulse, for example, will do just fine DPS with 1 dead node. Anyways, from Act 1, like I said, at the end we take Arc, and there's really not too much complicated to say about the passive tree between the end of Act 1 and the end of Act 3. POB's got a list of all the gems, when you take them, where you take them, all that good stuff. I'll leave that to the written guide. But the only thing that I'll point out verbally here for leveling between Act 1 and end of Act 3 is that this wheel over here, the acrimony wheel on the tree, we're going to want to make sure we save this for the very end, for like right at the end of Act 3, beginning of Act 4, maybe not even take it at all before doing our first labyrinth. This is something that we are only going to benefit from once we start igniting by taking Shaper of Flames in our first labyrinth. So these nodes here, they're only giving damage over time. They do nothing for the hit version of the skill, so they would also be dead nodes for a couple levels until such time as you take that first labyrinth and get those first ascendancy points. And again, that's usually around end of Act 3, beginning of Act 4. I will say, just as a brief note, this is another juncture at which an experienced Path of Exile player would be more than welcome to improvise on this leveling tree and go a different route. If you're a beginner, though, I encourage you to just follow along with what I'm doing here, because the steps are laid out more clearly. If you are experienced, though, feel free to take Shaper of Flames later on and level with a hit-based tree. You'll just have to respec. There's no problem with that. If you are following my leveling setup, though, we'll take Shaper of Flames as our first ascendancy point, continue to fill out the pretty mundane skill tree and get our skill gems as described in the POB, and we will shoot to take Shaper of Storms as our second ascendancy point, which comes around the end of Act 7 or beginning of Act 8. And this is just going to give us a big, raw damage boost. There's nothing fancy or complicated. Shock makes enemies take more damage, and we're shocking all enemies with this. The third ascendancy point we take, which we will do right before facing the final boss of Act 10, it has to be Mastermind of Discord. We don't have another option here. Remember to have a separate Wave of Conviction gem somewhere on your build to use as a debuff. This will allow you to inflict exposure on enemies, drastically lowering their resistance, and the Mastermind of Discord node will lower that resistance even further. However, it is useless if you are not if you're not applying exposure in some way. Mastermind of Discord only improves existing exposure, so you need to use Wave of Conviction. Now eventually we are going to automate the application of exposure, like I said, using our gloves, but early on we're not going to have the currency for that, and we do need to manually inflict exposure with Wave of Conviction on those tough bosses. Now, this is the point at which we will graduate into maps, and of course your number one priority by a mile is making sure that you have followed the universal guidance to cap out your elemental resistances at 75% and get your life pool to around, or better yet, above 3,000. We do not take any scaling for energy shield, so although having energy shield on your gear can be a nice buffer in emergencies, like you don't need to avoid energy shield, I would also encourage you not to think of it as equivalent to the rest of your health pool at this stage. In other words, don't feel safe at 2400 life just because you've got 500 energy shield. That can fail you when you need it the most, and it cannot be recovered with a life flask. So once you've got those basics sorted out, though, once you want to start thinking about a weapon, well, first of all, I prefer to level this weapon or this build at all times with Scepter as my weapon, because using a Scepter allows us to use the Smite skill, which temporarily buffs our arc damage, and we use that in single target bossing situations. Additionally, I like to level this build with a shield, because we will be using a shield eventually, so you just get used to it, and also it enables us to use the potent movement skill Shield Charge, as I mentioned. But, you know, preference here, if you wanted to focus on as much damage as possible, you could theoretically level with a dual wielding wand or dual wielding scepter setup and get more damage. That's fine. You know, no complaints there. But if you're looking for a rare scepter, here's the mods that you would be interested in, and I'm going to put them in approximate order of priority, though of course the exact state of your build will dictate what the true priority is, and Path of Building can tell you what's best. So, mods you want: +1 to level of all spell gems, +1 to level of lightning spell gems, flat added damage to spells, increased lightning damage, increased fire damage, increased damage over time, fire damage over time multiplier, and generic damage over time multiplier. In fact, actually, early in maps, when the gem level is pretty low, a sufficiently high roll of added flat spell damage might actually outclass a +1 gems modifier, whereas later on, +1 gems is going to outclass all of the flat added damage that you'd be able to get on a weapon. But two important warnings. Number one, make sure any flat damage you get says damage to spells. If it doesn't say to spells, then it's just adding damage to the weapon, and it doesn't do diddly donut for us. And the other important caveat is, do not under any circumstances prioritize spell damage. It does virtually nothing for us once we have switched over to start scaling damage over time. It is one of the few caster type mods, spell caster type mods, that can roll on a weapon that will do nothing for us. It is bait. It does not influence the strength of the Ignite in any way. Now, if you wanted to just ignore all that and take a simpler route with a unique weapon, I can definitely recommend the Singularity Scepter. It is outrageously good DPS for the early versions of this build before we really start pouring currency into it. It is tough to outclass this with a rare weapon early on. So yeah, definitely don't overpay for a rare weapon if Singularity is available. I'm betting that if you check POB, you will find that it is either better than or pretty darn close to a rare weapon that you might buy, but at a fraction of the cost. Singularity is cheap, it's super common. Now, the other cheap unique that you can take eventually is the helmet Eye of Malice, but I want to caution you here about this one. It is important that you don't take this upgrade until you have that set of gloves that I talked about that has Eldritch implicits on them, and this gives us the ability to inflict fire exposure on every single hit. So the entire gimmick of Eye of Malice is that it gives 50% increased fire and cold resistance, which, sounds terrible, but remember that in Path of Exile, increased is just a mathematical keyword that simply means, in this case, increased by 50% is multiplied by 1.5. Well, what happens when you multiply a negative number? Gets more negative. So if you're able to reliably get all enemies' resistances into the negative just by hitting them one time and applying exposure, with Mastermind of Discord improving and amplifying the exposure, then having Eye of Malice is an enormous offensive boost for us by drastically cratering the enemy's elemental resistances even further into the negative. But before you can reliably inflict exposure on every hit, I don't want you relying on the chance to inflict exposure that comes on this helmet. It's only a 25% chance, and it's going to feel clunky in some circumstances. Quick aside here, since we're talking about those exposure gloves, when you do get those gloves with fire exposure on hit as one Eldritch implicit, all Eldritch Influence items can have two implicits. Make sure that the other one is Ignite Proliferation. That is my guidance. This allows us to swap away from the Ignite Proliferation support gem in our main damage setup and let us get a far more damaging support gem in there in its place. You want Proliferation for clear speed, but it's the most efficient to get it on your gloves. Then other early upgrades besides those gloves and helmet, you're going to want to target as you work your way through those early maps. You're going to get your first few scraps of currency, and you're going to look at things like your 6-link body armor. That's a potent offensive buff. Your first 6-link is not going to be anything fancy. We're not going to go for Incandescent Heart right away. You're probably just going to get a corrupted rare that it's got the socket colors you need, and hopefully maybe a little life and resist if you're lucky. But it doesn't need to be anything too fancy for that first one. It can be cheap. You're going to look for, a 2 passive small cluster jewel with Enduring Composure as a notable. This is the way we get our endurance charges. It's an important part of our defense, and it's not expensive to get. You can buy it for cheap, and you can probably roll it for even cheaper. Pay like a chaos to get yourself a small cluster jewel with 2 passives, and passives grant armor, and just alt spam that until you get Enduring Composure and then regal it up. Nothing to it. I'd be surprised if it cost you more than 5 or 10 C for that, but it's really important. And then the other thing, the big one here, is we're going to look for a pair of Call of the Brotherhood rings, our endgame ring, which lets us take advantage of cold to fire support. So I questioned, when these patch notes came out, without the bonus from Shaper of Flames for having fire as the highest damage type, would it be worth it to still go for cold to fire support? Because that was one of the big reasons we were taking cold to fire support, was just to make sure that we were getting the majority of damage as fire and getting that bonus, which no longer exists. Well, I POB'd it out, and as it turns out, this still turns out to be an optimal setup. Like, it's just a really good raw damage node in this build. So yeah, and it's going to become even more optimal when we start using Incandescent Heart later, and we're now triple dipping on elemental conversion, and it's good even before Incandescent Heart. So yep, just wanted to point that out, that we still take Call of the Brotherhood early, we still take Cold to Fire support early the way we would have last league, and it's still a DPS boost for us. Now I will point out that Call of the Brotherhood is a ring that used to be, many leagues ago, this used to be much more expensive because it was in a higher tier of rarity. It just dropped less often, so it had a higher price. It has since been lowered and is quite common, and I don't foresee them changing it back, but just in case they do, here's my caveat and my warning. Please don't overpay for these. If by chance the drop rate has declined or something, I wouldn't want somebody to pay more than like 20 chaos per ring, 25 at the outside, and certainly not, in the opening 2 days of a league. Don't be spending all the money you get on these. But yeah, outside of those very few cheap unique items, though, the early mapping version of this build for a while, it really doesn't need much except the passive tree and the rare gear to get a couple million DPS and a reasonable health pool. But it's at this point that we're going to start pushing. We're going to want to start getting into red maps and start farming the real serious currency that we need to make the one big changeover to Chaos Inoculation. And this is the place where we're going to be swapping out many of our gear pieces all at the same time. I highly recommend planning this transition out in Path of Building before you do it. Just as you slowly acquire the gear for the changeover, paste that gear into Path of Building and see what your life is going to look like once you make the changeover. Make sure that you have enough mana to reserve, or mana reservation efficiency rather, to reserve discipline, and make sure that you've got enough energy shield after the switch. I have been asked several times in the past, is it reasonable to start using any of the end game uniques from this transition process early, before you make the transition? And I've got a different response for each of the big three. My response for Nebulous is that it is never worth it to use Nebulous early. Never, ever, ever. You want your max resist at least at 84, and preferably a lot higher for this to be a good value proposition over just a generic rare scepter with decent mods. Ideally, you'd want to have close to 90 or 90 max res before you switch over to using the Nebulous. Like, that's just the whole gimmick of the scepter, and it's not worth using without it, and that involves a lot of expense. You need to get Melding of the Flesh, which is a jewel. That's going to be expensive. And you need to get a lot of maximum cold resistance, which means more expensive jewels and more mana reservation efficiency to squeeze in Purity of Ice, and that can be expensive. Now, expense here is relative. Like I said, I'm talking like hopefully no more than 20-25 divines, as long as Melding of the Flesh isn't like outlandish in price. That's one of the things that could really spike the cost of the endgame version if for some reason that goes through the roof. But those are the two of the three. But for the third one, or no, I'm sorry, that's only the first one. The second one is Incandescent Heart. It is rarely but not never worth it to use Incandescent Heart early before the CI transition. You would not want to use it unless you've managed to max out your chaos resistance at 75, since otherwise the conversion of incoming elemental damage to chaos is going to get you killed if you're sitting at like 0 or 10 chaos res. But then, okay, that's two: Nebulous, Incandescent Heart. And the third one, it often is worth it to use Aegis Aurora early, as long as you've got the block chance to back it up. This ES on block business here, that is a potent defensive layer even before Chaos Inoculation. Unfortunately, this is also typically the most expensive item in this wave of upgrades. It's either going to be this or Melding of the Flesh. Technically, you don't even have to go Melding of the Flesh in the first wave of upgrades. Like, as you're upgrading, you can theoretically just skip Nebulous, skip Melding, skip Purity of Ice, and just go to Chaos Inoculation with a rare scepter, Incandescent Heart, Aegis Aurora. And as long as you've got that 3.2, 3.5k energy shield, you can save the other stuff for a second wave of upgrades. No problem with that. Now, at this point, really, to get that energy shield up to where you need it to be, the main things you're saving up for at this point are whatever cluster jewels and blight oils that you need to make sure that you've got the mana res efficiency to squeeze in the discipline aura, and then on top of that, whatever rare items that you need at the boots, gloves, and potentially helmet slot to get over that like 3.2, 3.4, 3.5k energy shield mark after accounting for discipline. Now, on the topic of the helmet, I said maybe, maybe not, right? On the topic of helmet, it is, in my opinion, a perfectly acceptable decision to use a high energy shield base helmet in place of Eye of Malice for as long as you need to. Yes, it is a loss in damage, but we're still going to be doing a decent amount of damage without it. And staying alive, if this makes the difference in staying alive, it is worth the sacrifice. I think you're just going to find it a lot comfier to achieve a nice energy shield pool without needing tier 1 prefixes on your gloves and boots. If you just take a rare energy shield helmet, take the mastery that gives you 100% increased energy shield from helmet, good to go. From there, upgrades start to get more specific, more esoteric. Like I said, we'll focus on the maximum cold res, the mono res efficiency, more stuff like that. I'll refer you to the path of building and my older video guides on that. But also you can follow along in the new league with my build diary series and just see how and when I'm making these upgrades. So in any case, that will be it for this video. I hope some of you at least consider giving the build a shot on League Start if you feel it's a good fit for you. For now though, thank you for tuning in and take it easy.